Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is the power of history. History is so important, and it is often simply pushed to the side. Rule number one, whoever owns the history has possession of the power. And that is why history is so often in dispute, why it is so often fought over, and that explains why people, especially those with leadership roles, create history. Rule number two, at all costs, avoid the role of perpetrator. That is why history is so often rewritten, often by the perpetrators. It is better to be a victim than a perpetrator. It is better to be a bystander than a perpetrator. The commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau forced many people to think about history and to wrestle with difficult, troubling historical realities and memories. As we listen to the commemorative speeches delivered by the many dignitaries, 46 presidents, prime ministers, and kings gathered in Jerusalem to acknowledge this event. We need to pay very careful attention to the details. The numbers are clear. Most of the people, most non-Jews in Eastern and Central Europe during World War II were bystanders. They lived in the areas where Nazis perpetrated their historically unprecedented murderous campaign against the Jews of Europe. They were concerned about their own lives. There was also a significant number of Europeans who assisted the Nazis in their mass murder. But it was the silence of the masses of bystanders that enabled the murderers. And now, these 75 years later, the realization of the fact still resonates, and people assuage their guilt. It's easier to explain to your children and grandchildren that you, yourself, were a victim than to explain that you participated in the evil, mass murderous policies of the Nazis. It's easier to say that you were simply silent, worrying about your own life and the lives of your family, than to say that you were involved, that you were complicit. That this is also true as a nation. Once you have adopted the label of bystander nation, it's easy to blur the lines and say that you were victims of the Nazis and their associates. It's easier than admitting that you watched, knowing fully the evil that was happening around you. Easier than admitting that you had heard the screams, the stories, the reports, and went about your daily life. This is true for a country as well as an individual. We are witnessing a revision of history. Several world leaders, under the guise of paying tribute to this momentous event, are taking advantage of the world stage to distance themselves from the Nazis and Nazi evil. Most blatant of all this is Vladimir Putin, president of Russia. Putin is continuing a historical rewrite that has been part of the Soviet narrative since the end of World War II. 75 years later, Europe, and by extension, the former Soviet Union, wants to embrace the role of victim. At the Auschwitz Memorial in Jerusalem, Russian President Putin said that 40% of the Jewish victims of the Nazis were Soviets. He said that with pride, almost boastfully. For the sake of historical honesty, we can all agree that between 26 and 50 million Soviets were killed in the war. Many froze or starved to death. But Putin wants to transform all 100% of Soviets alive during World War II into Nazi victims. The Holocaust happened under the veil of World War II. That must be clearly understood. It was a policy of the Nazis. One cannot conflate the two, that is World War II and the Holocaust, separate, one under the other. The purpose of the Nazi Holocaust was to murder all Jews. First, the Jews of Europe, then the Jews of the world. Russia is deliberately forgetting the important historical events. They were not simply victims. They had an alliance with the Nazis. At the beginning of World War II, they were even partners with the Nazis. On August 23, 1939, Russia and Germany signed a treaty called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the foreign ministers of both countries, Joachim von Ribbentrop of Germany and Molotov of the Soviet Union. The two countries agreed to simultaneously invade Poland from opposite sides, squeezing it. Germany invaded on September 1st and Russia on September 17th. The plan was successful. They squeezed Poland from both sides. And in the aftermath, Poland, too, has rewritten history. Poland, where the most notorious of all Nazi death camps, most notably Auschwitz-Birkenau, has tried to transform itself into a country of victims. For decades, first as Soviets and now as Russians, Putin and his country have conveniently forgotten the essential facts of the war. Russian leadership has chosen instead to emphasize Operation Barbarossa, when on Sunday, June 22nd, 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. I will never forget the first time I heard this claim to victimhood. I was in what was then the USSR, and the tour guide explained that the Soviets entered the war, that's World War II, in June of 1941. I tried to correct her. She did not believe me. She thought that I was making up history. I was creating history. Rule number 3, created memory is as strong as true memory. History that is rewritten is even more powerful sometimes than actual factual history. That's why it's important to catch the revisionists and the reimaginers in the act. That's why it's so important to call them out and set the record straight. History is not a game, it is power. Nietzsche wrote a spectacular essay in the form of a short pamphlet. I reread the essay at least once a year. It keeps me honest. I recommend that every single person read it at least once. If you're not going to read it, at least remember its title. It's entitled The Use and Abuse of History. I've also been thinking about other forms of persecution, about mental persecution faced by many people in many countries today. For example, I've been thinking about the persecution of Said Ayoun. Said Ayoun is a judo champion. He defected from Syria, his homeland, and now lives in the Netherlands. Because of his defection, and the defection of others, especially from Iran, the International Judo Federation, the IJF, has created a team that competes under the flag of the federation. This new team is composed of refugees from Iran and Syria and other parts of the Arab world. Team members wear the emblem of the IJF on their uniform. Stories depicting how Iran forced their judo athletes to default or lose international matches so as not to compete against Israelis have made their way into mainstream Western media. Several of those athletes have defected and, while they still crave the competitions, have not had a country that would sponsor them. That situation has now changed. And it is good news. Good news for the athletes, great news for the sport, and for judo aficionados. Under the protective umbrella provided them by the IJF, these athletes were even permitted to compete in the International Judo Grand Prix, which was held and hosted by Israel in Tel Aviv on January 23rd through 25th. But Said Ayoun didn't attend. Things did not work out so well. Said Ayoun is now 32 years old. He was scheduled to compete in Israel in the 66-kilo weight class. He was very much looking forward to competing in Israel and has, courtesy of previous international competitions, Israeli friends with whom he was in touch during this difficult period of transition from Syria, the national defector, to the Netherlands. Even though he's now competing under the flag of the International Judo Federation, Said Ayoun became concerned about his safety and protection while in Israel. And understandably so, Ayoun and his family started receiving threats, death threats. He contacted the Dutch police to file reports. More and more threats came pouring in, many of them vicious threats. So afraid of what might happen, Said Ayoun withdrew from the Judo Grand Prix. He did not compete in Tel Aviv. What happened? Why the change of heart? Why the death threats? Here's why. The Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs posted about Ayoun coming to Israel to participate in the judo competition. They posted it in Arabic. They posted it on Facebook. It was picked up and then translated into Farsi, which is Iran, and spread throughout Iran. And that's what set off the media frenzy and the death threats. Sports are supposed to be above politics. And because Iran publicized the sport, everything from chess to judo, Iran has become censured in international competitive organizations. I understand just how proud Israel was to host this competition and to have refugees and defectors come to compete in the Jewish state. These athletes hailed from countries that have sworn the destruction of Israel. And now they were competing along Israelis in Israel. That's a huge success. But the Foreign Ministry of Israel overstepped the boundary. It was a mistake to out Said Ayoun, and it was a bigger mistake to out him in Arabic and to out him before the event began. That's not to say that the information, if posted in English, would not have been found by enemies and evil people, but Israel served it to them on a silver platter. It would have taken longer and to spread the word, and would not have been Israel jabbing the Arab and Muslim world in Arabic. Sometimes diplomats should know this better than most. It's important to be silent and not to draw attention to yourself or to cause, no matter how noble or how just it may be. This is one such time. People's lives are at stake, as is the success of the Judo Grand Prix. That's not to argue that one should be fearful of the new media thugs who rely on bullying and intimidation, but one need not help them facilitate their dastardly plots. Saeed Ayoun could have been a poster boy for Arab-Israeli interaction, but that would have happened after the fact, when he was safe and sound back in the Netherlands. Israel is a sucker for positive international attention, and sports is the perfect vehicle to get that attention. That's why Israel will most likely repeat the same mistake. It's taken 72 long, hard years for Israel to even approach a level of normal interaction with her neighbors. Israelis are giddy with delight that they are finally recognized and dealt with and engaged with and considered to be a bright spot in the region, not a blight to be condemned. In this case, however, in the name of extending a hand of friendship, they caused a friend pain and helped stain a worthwhile endeavor. The impact of this poor decision to post in Arabic has the potential for larger destructive backlash. It can intimidate many others, individuals and leaders contemplating making the move to befriend Israel. They may determine that because of the probability of negative reactions and threats heaped on those making the effort to publicly befriend Israel, it is simply not worth the risk. That is a shame. Coming up next, points of view. Here's what some important voices have been talking about. First up is a column from the New York Times. It is entitled, "When Being Jewish Means Being Afraid." And then it reads in a sub-headline, "The recent uptick in anti-Semitic crimes has made me appreciate my mother's concerns in unexpected ways." The column is authored by Jordan Salama, a young Iraqi Jew born in New York to a family that escaped Iraq. It's very powerful. It's a powerful piece about growing up, not understanding the fear that his mother felt about publicly being Jewish. This new anti-Semitism has given Salama a newfound understanding. This is how he begins. Growing up, my brothers and I often teased my mom for having what we thought was an irrational fear of being identified as a Jew. She painted over the Star of David on a duffel bag because when we were traveling, she didn't want people to know. She warned my dad not to drive fast to my aunt's house on Yom Kippur because she thought more speed traps were set during the Jewish holidays. If we said a word like Shabbat in a department store, she seemed to hear it from aisles away. We were not to say Jewish things too loudly in public, she taught us. Better to be safe. These things did not make sense to us, three brothers extraordinarily lucky to have grown up in a New York suburb where safety was hardly a worry at all, where any kind of violent crime, let alone violence against Jews, was so rare it was almost unfathomable. But my mother had her own reasons, and they were valid. She grew up not in the United States, but in Baghdad. Watching through the wide and curious eyes of a 6-year-old in the early 70s as 2,000 years of peaceful Jewish life there came crashing down around her. Jordan Salama is a great storyteller. Even though we all know the story, it's still gripping to read, especially because it's not about a Jew from Europe, but it's about a Jew from the Middle East. He continues on remembering the stories that were told of his mother and his mother's family, how wealthy they were, what they accomplished, the fun and beauty, the opulence and the culture, and then the persecution. He writes, "My mother remembers when they imprisoned her father along with other Jews. Remembers her mother going every day to the jail where he was being held. Remembers the emptiness the family felt the morning after her cousins escaped over the border to Iran. When she was 3 years old in January 1969, 9 Jews were hanged in the main city square. By 1972, my mother's family was among some of the last to leave, bound for the United States. Today, the number of Jews remaining in Iraq is reported to be in the single digits." This is the story my mother remembers, the story she has always feared would repeat itself, that no matter how comfortable we as Jews may feel today, It only takes a small group of people and a large group of people to sit idly by to turn everything on its head. This sounds familiar. His conclusion is clear to all of us. Jordan Salama makes it very clear that silence is not an option. He concludes, the answer, of course, is to act. We are all guilty of not acting, to push back on our suffocating culture of complacency, that if we're not directly in harm's way right now, we do nothing, and be the ones to go against the grain until the grain goes in the right direction. Make people uncomfortable when they say or do something they shouldn't, no matter how innocuous it may seem, so that we may look back upon these decades not as the moment when more could have been done, but as a mere malignant spike in a generally positive direction. Our children will thank us for looking out for them, for understanding all that is at risk. I now thank my mom every chance I get. The scourge of anti-Semitism is growing. We need to make certain that we are not silent. Second up is an op-ed from the New York Post, dated the 16th of January 2020, online, and the 17th in print. It's written by Micah Report. The title in print is Fear and Loathing in Crown Heights. The online edition is a very different title. Crown Heights Blacks Jews share real community that's now under threat. The editors seem to have conflated two issues. These are very important titles evoking very different issues. Micah describes a community that lives together in a simulated form of unity in Crown Heights. She writes that Crown Heights, Brooklyn, blacks and Jews live in the same buildings even, share the same celebrations and the same tragedies. Micah Report begins by describing the community. It is a community that has been the epicenter of anti-Semitic attacks in Brooklyn itself. She begins, as in most of Crown Heights, strollers, tricycles, balls, and scooters fill the lobby of the apartment building where I live with my family. Children are constantly going in and out of one another's apartments. Little girls huddle together with snacks as they block staircases, and wild dodgeball games take place in the courtyard on Shabbat afternoon. Crown Heights, recently in the news because of the violent anti-Semitic attacks, is home to the followers of the Chabad Lubavitch movement. They have lived in the neighborhood since the early 1940s. Like most buildings here, ours is occupied by black and Jewish occupants. Families are, in general, neighborly and respectful to one another, and some have become close. Last summer, tragedy struck a black family in our building when their son was murdered in an altercation at a bodega a few blocks away. Jewish families organized a meal train so that the grieving mother and children wouldn't have to worry about dinner for a few weeks. Now Micah quotes from a video clips depicting blacks in Crown Heights and what they say about Jews and the anti-Semitism that's happening right now. The perceptions are so base and so ugly that I cannot bring myself to even say them on air. The speakers literally justify violence and physical attacks against Jews. She concludes by saying, in the last few years, 3 families in the neighborhood's Chabad community have adopted non-white children and written publicly about it. I'm one of these adopted mothers, and I've spoken to Jewish women about my experience, the foster care crisis, and the need to rid ourselves of bias as we raise the next generation of Jewish children. The young women I speak to, mostly under 40, are responsive to the message. These communal shifts in attitude have made the recent onslaught of attacks on Jews by blacks all the more traumatic. Chabad mothers' social media groups are filled with recommendations on where to get pepper spray, how to find self-defense classes, and expressions of anxiety and sadness about feeling unsafe. The progress that I see around me will be threatened if anti-Semitic attacks continue in Crown Heights. Malka is correct, but the story is not just limited to Crown Heights. The danger is not simply in Crown Heights and in Brooklyn, or in New York City for that matter. The danger lurks throughout America. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. We're going to look at 2 cartoons today. Both deal with President Trump's deal of the century. The first is from Germany and drawn by Rainer Hachfeld. It was published on January 28, 2020. Trump and Bibi are together, smiling. Trump is holding up a scroll, and it's the deal of the century is embossed on it with an American and Israeli flag. Next to them is a Palestinian eagle, and through the eagle's heart are three lines that hold the deal in place. This is a powerful image. That could have been more powerful, by the way, if the whole was made with a sword or a saber or even 3 bullets. Next up is a cartoon by Ahmad Hajjaj and was published in the Al-Arabi Al-Jaid in London. It was published on January 27th, the day before. This cartoon is entitled Deal of the Century. Trump is standing on Palestinian President Abbas, who was lying on his back on the ground. Trump is shaking the hands of 2 Israelis, Bibi Netanyahu and Benny Gantz. The point is obvious. The United States and Israel make a deal, and essentially the third party is not even there, or worse, he's trampled on. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. The Middle East is such a traditional region, and yet it's still changing. Israel is the cause of much of that change, and it's very positive change. Traditional ideas about energy sources were that Arabs have it and Israel doesn't. For decades, there were even jokes about it. That's changing. As of mid-January, Israel began exporting natural gas to Egypt. The agreement between Israel and Egypt was leaked to the media in October. According to the details of the deal, Israel will provide about 9 billion cubic meters of natural gas annually to Egypt. That process began in January 2020. Jordan has also signed a natural gas contract with Israel. Our parents would never have imagined a day when Israeli companies would be providing fossil fuel energy to Arab countries around it. Never would have imagined it. And despite the increasing friendly deals between Israel and her Arab neighbors, here in the United States, we're witnessing more and more new anti-Semitism. It's spreading and spreading quickly. We touched upon the problem in the columns section, but not about the root causes and the possible antidotes. Never would I have envisioned so many blatant attacks against Jews. Never would I have imagined that Jews would physically be attacked for simply being Jewish. Verbal and physical attacks have reached new heights, and I do not see them diminishing. I see them increasing. The attack in Muncie with a machete-wielding African-American attacked a Hanukkah celebration, wounding 5 people and telling a telling example not only of the new anti-Semitism, but also of the effect that it has on the general, specifically non-Jewish public. Of course, politicians decried the attack, but it is the silence of leaders, role models, who need to speak out and really condemn these attacks that's so deafening. These attacks are no longer outliers. They are not marginal people anymore. They are attacking every day and often in broad daylight. Where are the religious leaders? Where are their leaders? Why are Jews standing all alone confronting this scourge? Why has the community at large not stood up and said these ideas and actions are not acceptable? I don't mean the Jewish community, I mean the community at large. Could it be that these leaders are silent because it is they who stimulate the hatred and tolerate the hatred, maybe? Religious leadership of America, step forward. Jewish America needs you to step forward. If not for our sake, do it for the sake of your community. If you don't do it, if you don't stand with the Jews of America, you are, in essence, telegraphing the message that you are complicit in this growing scourge of anti-Semitic attacks. Over 1 billion locusts devoured 200 tons of food every day as they make their way through Africa and the Middle East. Locusts. The locust swarm is so dense that it looks black. It's impossible to see outside, impossible to walk outside. It is the largest swarm of locusts in 25 years. A locust plague will destroy crops and trees and almost every herb and tree, everything green. The locust swarm can travel 4,000 miles in 10 days. Locusts can fly 200 miles without setting down and rest and eat. Using the word plague is deliberate. Locust destruction is biblical. There is increased tension on the ground in Syria between the United States and Russia. U.S. troops are in Syria to secure the oil fields and keep them safe from ISIS and from other terrorist groups. 4 times in 8 days, the United States had to intercept and block a Russian convoy going to the oil regions. At first, the U.S. stopped them. The Russians turned back. Then the Russians sent a helicopter. And in response to the Russian helicopter, the United States dispatched 2 helicopters to bring down the Russian helicopter. These tensions are fierce, and they could easily escalate at any moment into a full-blown attack if any step is exaggerated or mistaken. These events are not covered in the Western press. That's a mistake. We need to monitor this situation very closely. India is the 3rd largest consumer of oil in the world. India needs oil. They realize they need oil, and they have been implementing a plan to ensure that they continue to receive a regular stream of imported oil. For 3 years in a row, India has reduced the amount of oil that they import from the Middle East itself. To give you a sense of the numbers, in 2018, they imported 65%. In 2019, it went down. Now they're at 60%. India understands the need to reduce their dependence on Middle East oil. The political situation is too volatile. Iran has made the region unpredictable, and so India and other countries are responding. During the same period, India has been cutting back on their Middle East oil. The United States has become energy sufficient. The United States is now producing enough oil that there is no need to import oil anymore. The United States still does import, but they are now significant exporters as well. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Did you know that we used to make fun of the fact that there was no oil or gas in Israel? Everywhere else in the region, there was plenty of gas and oil. But now things have changed, and Israel now is a player in the energy world. My father was a scientist. I remember as a young child, maybe 8, hearing my father explain to a group of colleagues that it was inconceivable that there is so much gas and oil in the region and none in Israel. He said they just need to improve their search and test deeper. And indeed, that's what Israel did, and they found gas, natural gas, and plenty of it. The world is energy dependent on fossil fuels right now. Natural gas is better and more efficient, and that is what Israel has found and is exporting. But finding and selling gas is just a short-term windfall for Israel. It's not the future. The future is finding a replacement for fossil fuels. The country that hosts the scientist that discovers the efficient replacement for fossil fuels will engine the entire economy of the world for 3 decades. It will be equivalent to the Microsoft invention. And everyone should know that the hunt is on right now, and scientists are racing to that goal. It is exciting, and Israel is at the front of the pack among many nations searching for the solution to the world's oil problem. My father would have been proud. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.